we have a couple of minutes before the officials start here, but I'll go ahead and get going. We got plenty to do. One, I'm moving into the 21st century. Lawrence has shaved me now. I continues the projector, and he used this Wednesday night. So I apologize. Some of the slides, I didn't have this slide, so some may be a little small in the print. So bear with us. Because we get 45 minutes, we get to cover everything there is about $4 and sovereignty and really just opening doors of thought on most of these subjects. You know, the deity and humanity of Christ. We could spend an entire trimester talking about that, but we decided to try to cover both sides of these paradoxes in one class, and then maybe in the flex classes come back and dig a little deeper if Lawrence or Jared decide we want to. It is interesting, I think, Lawrence on the deity and humanity of Christ, while in many ways very puzzling, I think most of us, we recognize these are paradoxes. You know, how is this little bitty baby God? How does God, as Jay pointed out, how is he driven by the Spirit? How is on some days he has this power to perform miracles and all these other kinds of questions, but I think we tend to sort of accept those. Now, I mentioned last Sunday, 40-ish years ago, a bunch of preachers in our world got at odds with each other, not so much trying to explain the paradoxes, but emphasizing one side and then saying, well, the people emphasizing the other side, well, here's what you really mean. Kind of balled up into a bunch of nonsense. But in the end, both sides, I think, more or less accepted deity and humanity. But I think today's subject, while in many ways I think we're accepting of the paradoxes, I do think in some ways in very personal ways it provides challenges to us, some of which we'll get into next week or on Wednesday. I think Garrett has a providence and sovereignty of God and prayer. So the sovereignty of God business overflows into a number of things. I mentioned last Sunday that Lawrence and I have talked about these things a lot in runs over the years. I mentioned Jim has often made a reference to this grace and faith tension. How does something that's recast everything you have? And Jim's here with us. Jim and I have taught prayer providence a couple of times, and certainly that presents paradoxes that are related closely to what we're going to talk about today. So by the sovereignty of God, we're just talking about God's rule and authority and choices. And so we'll hop into here. Let me ask you all to begin with. So, what passages come to your mind if you're thinking about passages that express God's sovereignty and his knowledge and maybe foreknowledge of events, his plans, his purposes? So what, I know those probably aren't all passages you just have immediately memorized. It's not Jesus wept sort of passages. So what might come to mind?
Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. This seemed to be something God had set in motion, knew what was going to transpire, these dreams of Nebuchadnezzar. Others?
Joseph.
Yeah.
His brothers, he said twice in our reading this week that you meant for evil, but God meant for good.
Yeah. God has plans, and even to the extent we have choices that go one direction, he can work those to his direction. Others?
Esther, for such a time as this, indicating that God, understood what would lead to.
Yeah, that Mordecai say, hey, maybe God has placed you in this very position for this very purpose. What about the New Testament?
First, the introduction of 1 Peter Those are those who are elect exiles of the various regions according to the foreknowledge of God the Father.
Yeah. So these.
But I cheated, I used my,
Yeah, sure.
I just looked up foreknowledge.
Yeah. Yeah. Foreknowledge, that word occurs in various places. I selected a few places. You probably can't see that very well, but Psalm 139 has several expressions like this. But your eyes saw my full body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. Isaiah, there's no other God like you. I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient time. My purpose will stand. Paul or Peter on Pentecost, this man was handed over to by God's deliberate plan. Jeremiah, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. There are a number, the Bible has many of these sorts of expressions. One of the hallmark passages that Philip and Caleb and who else was in there? Joshua and John were teaching from Paul's letter. Ephesians, the first chapter. Even before he made the world, God loved us and chose us in Christ to be holy and without fault in his eyes. For he chose us in advance, and he makes everything work out according to his plan. And so it's hard to think of passages that more directly speak to God's plans, purposes, authority, sovereignty, choices than these. And this, though, presents a paradox, because then if I ask you, what about passages that come to mind that express, we can refer to, and we're not going to get into a lot of nuances of man's agency versus free will. By agency, we're referring to our delegated choice, the choices we have that God has carved out for us. If we want to express it that way, our ability to choose and our will. But what passages seem to express our ability to make choices?
Any passage that gives a command assumes it doesn't matter which it is.
Yeah, exactly. The Bible is filled with instructions of various sorts. Then implicit in that is the idea that, well, we can choose to obey those or not. What? In Genesis 2, where does that begin? Lawrence is our Genesis 2 man.
Yeah, don't eat of this tree.
Yeah, every tree you can eat, but not this one. And Genesis 2 and 3 then unfold based on Adam and Eve's choices relative to that instruction. What are some other specific examples like this?
When Joshua says, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river.
Yeah, that gets it right. Makes it explicit. Hey, you choose this day. I'm choosing, and my family, we're choosing this direction. And we could go on and on. I've put both of those in here in the passages. Well, I went backwards. All right. Better go forward. Yeah, I know. Genesis 1 and 2. Ezekiel 18, the souls have sinned and survived. You can't blame other people. You can't blame your ancestors for the choices you're making. Ezekiel 18 is like Joshua 24. 2 Peter, therefore, my brothers and sisters, make every effort to make your calling and election. So this references God's actions, but also make all sorts of effort to make this more certain. Galatians 5, my brothers and sisters, you are called to be free, but don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh, but rather serve one another. It's sort of interesting. Various passages make the paradox explicit, like Proverbs 16. In their hearts, human plan abhors, humans plan abhors, but the Lord establishes their steps. This sort of brings the two together Paul does this. Well, another one I didn't have room to fit on here, but I was thinking after I made this slide out. What does Paul, again, another Paul's letters we talked about last trimester. What does Paul encourage Timothy with regard to his gift? Exercises. Fan the flame of the gift given to you how? The gift of God. Well, yes, they had helped him in the passage I'm thinking about. The gift of God through laying on of my hands. And so the gift of God that had been, Paul had been the vehicle. Sometimes I think we get so fixated on the laying on. It, like 1 Corinthians 12 said, it's the Spirit who's giving the gifts. And yet he says this gift that's given by God, to some extent Timothy has some ability to exercise it and to quench it or to fan the flames of that. Paul lays this paradox out for us in his sermon, very in a nutshell. Again, you can think of other passages that do this, but in Athens on Mars Hill, it says, from one man, God created all the nations throughout the whole earth. He decided beforehand when they should rise and fall, and he determined their boundaries. What was the purpose in this? So that we would seek after him and perhaps feel their way. So here again, this sort of brings both ends together. It's saying God has plans and purposes and is appointing things this way and that way. And he's doing this so we would make choices that lead us toward him. All right. So there's the paradox. And I'm going to ask you kind of what Lawrence did on Wednesday. we're going to have time at the end for input and discussion, but as we go through this next part, I would ask you to kind of stick with me. What I'd like to do here is first attempt a partial resolution of a specific problematic text related to God's knowledge, plans, and foreknowledge. And then second, I'd like to discuss a little bit more recognizing the limits of our ability to solve this paradox and emphasizing the need to live with the paradox, much like we do with the deity and humanity of Christ. So the first passage, this specific passage I want to deal with, we were having dinner the night Philip was here, and we talked just a little bit about Romans 9. If there's a passage that is often sort of a hallmark of God's sovereignty, in fact, my Bible has a heading, God's sovereign choice, right in the middle of chapter 9 of Romans. So let's read this here. Just as is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. What then shall we say, is God unjust? Not at all, for he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. It does not therefore depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy. For Scripture says to Pharaoh, I raised you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Therefore, God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he pardons those he wants to pardon. One of you, later in the chapter, one of you will say to me, well, why does God still blame us? For who is able to resist his will? But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who is formed, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay of pottery for special purposes and some for common purposes? Now, like this subject as a whole, we're not going to dissect all of Romans 9 bit by bit. We don't have a chance to do that. But what I would like you to think about here, chapter 9 is clearly affirming that God has authority, and that authority matters. And he's working out his plans. Now, this sometimes has been used to make the point that, especially sections like the ones I put out here, that not only has God sovereign authority, but his authority is, in some ways, arbitrary. He chooses who he will. He chose Jacob over Esau. He chose Pharaoh to perform certain things. So, let's think about this Romans 9 here. Let's think about the bigger picture. You know, it's one of the difficulties. We divide books up into chapters, and we divide it up into verses, and to some extent, those can sometimes become our unit of analysis. When we don't do that necessarily in a letter, you know, letters written to us, we kind of realize, well, the beginning may be tied to the middle. Well, Romans ultimately is a letter. There are different ways of reading it, and there are subtly different ways of reading it. One is to view it, and the best might describe this as an overarching, systematic, and detailed way of explaining how justification or salvation works. And what I mean by abstract, he talks about Jews and Gentiles. It's written to these Roman Christians, but you could plug it out of that context and it would mean exactly the same thing. And in many ways, as others have said, this has kind of come to us as the predominant approach to Romans, that it's systematic theology. It's a way of tying everything, all the loose ends together, working it all out. An alternative, now let me say up front, these approaches overlap. They're not totally distinct from each other. But a different way is thinking this is revealing God's righteousness, his rightness, goodness, or faithfulness to his plans. It's emphasizing God's faithfulness to his plans through the history of Israel, and now with the Gentiles. Why would that matter to this church in Rome?
Mixed race.
Yeah, it was mixed, like many of these early churches were. It was mixed, and there were all sorts of things going on culturally with respect to the views of Greco-Romans toward Jews and Jews toward Romans and Greeks. Now, think about it, and I emphasize here chapter 1, verse 17. You know, we think about, well, what's the theme of Romans? You know, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. Or what? It's God's power to save, the power of God to salvation. For the Jew first, and also for the Greek. For in it, what does he say next? For in this, the righteousness of God is revealed. From different versions then render this next section a little differently. From faith to faith, or faith from first to last. But think about it for a minute. What is that phrase? The righteousness of God is revealed. So this letter is about revealing God's righteousness. What does it mean? Well, as I did here, his rightness, his goodness, his faithfulness. I think that's what, in part, this phrase from faith to faith is getting at. It's referring to God's faithfulness and then man's faith working together. And so, again, it's subtly different. Certainly, that's helping us understand something about God's saving us. But it's emphasizing this theme of God's faithfulness, God's rightness, his goodness. Jim?
Oh, I was just saying, the prepositional phrase of God, the righteousness of God, is always presents a wee bit of a problem to us. Like For example, in Romans, that phrase, the righteousness of God, can mean either God's quality of being a righteous being, good and so forth and so on, but it can also refer to his way of making us righteousness, so that Christ is the righteousness of God and we're made righteous through him. So not only does it express the quality of God's nature, but it expresses the way he begins, at least, to give us and to change us into that nature through Jesus Christ. He is the righteousness of God.
You know, one thing about these two approaches is, in some ways, the first approach takes chapters 1 to 4, and it's sort of one section, and 5 through 8 is another section, and then 9 through 11. Whereas, I think if you go with the second approach, these more consistently hang together. That as you work through chapters 1 through 11, it keeps coming back to and emphasizing God's faithfulness, and then how our faith ties into God's faithfulness. In fact, if you think about Romans 9, think about it through the lens of God's faithfulness to his promises. So, I get to plug the verses now, and I want to plug out. Well then has God failed to fulfill his promise to Israel? No, not at all. In other words, it is not by the children, by physical descent who are Abraham's children, but who is it? It's the children of promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. What then shall we say? That the Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have obtained it? A righteousness that comes out by faith. But the people of Israel who pursued law as the way of righteousness did not obtain it. Why not? Because they pursued it not by faith, but as it were by works. Goes on. Since then Israel did not know the righteousness of God and sought to establish their own righteousness, they did not submit to God's righteousness. They didn't submit to his plan, to his purposes. What was God's plan? What was his way of doing this? When we say God's faith, what promises is he being faithful to?
Well, to bring a Savior into this world.
And who did he say that to? Among others, Abraham. Right. By your seed, all the nations will be blessed. And on what basis? What basis was Abraham justified? Romans 4 brings a hammer out and just says, I'm going to pound this in. Abraham's faith is what connected him to God. Well, did God just decide all of a sudden here in Jesus and in Roman faith is going to matter? No. Faith mattered in Genesis 12 and 15. And so, you start thinking about it. Yes, Romans 9 is certainly emphasizing God's sovereignty, his ultimate authority, his power to make choices. But is it really saying that God is like some whimsical wizard who just says, well, I always get this, and I'm probably talking about the wrong thing. If I am, you can correct me, but it's like Mickey in Fantasia. The wizard's wand, and I can just do whatever I want. Is that God? No. What's Romans 9 saying about God's authority, his power? How does he use it? To pursue this path of being faithful to his promises, being faithful to what he said to Abraham. And so in this respect, again, this doesn't solve every paradox related to God's choices and our choices, but I think we should be careful about looking at Romans 9 and thinking Romans 9 saying, well, it's just God's arbitrary sovereignty. No. Romans 9 is sticking with this message that God has chosen the path of faith as his means of saving people through his plans and his choices. Now, with that said, let me take stock for a second here. All right, so God's choices are consistently about his mercy and about men's faith. That is the message of Romans. Now, the border between God's grace and our faith is a paradox itself. And we've got another class on that. I think maybe the board says that. So I'm going to let him. That's a deep paradox. And really another version of this. God's choosing and we're choosing. And how do you mesh those two together? But I'll hold off on that. But the paradox, one of among many, but one of the paradoxes is, what about God's foreknowledge and our freedom and our ability to choose? This aspect of God existing out of time. As Peter refers to it, 1,000 years of time is like a day. Well, that begins to present challenges to this idea of, well, we're really choosing. And I've got a little clip here. If you're not an Avengers fan, you can live with this. But for many of you, you'll remember this from Avengers Endgame as they're thinking about, well, how are we going to deal with Thanos? They're going to deal with this by traveling through time, but they've got to figure that out. How do you deal with time? So here's a little clip.
We get the stones before Thanos gets them. Thanos doesn't have the stones.
That's not how it works.
Well, that's what I heard.
What, by who?
Star Trek, Terminator, Time Cop, Time After Time.
Quantum Leap?
Basically any movie that deals with time travel.
Die Hard? No, that's not one.
This is known.
Think about it. If you travel to the past, that past becomes your future. And your former present becomes the past.
So, see, now you got it all worked out. I've captured this off a little YouTube site where what he's doing is talking about, well, does Avengers, and how they're put down of some of these movies, the guy's a big fan of Back to the Future. He said, well, maybe Back to the Future had it better than we thought. Well, did Back to the Future really solve the issue of time travel? Or did theoretical physicists that Bruce Banner is sort of representing here, do they have it all figured out? Well, I think we can all say resoundingly, well, no. That trying to figure out how things with a timeless God work through the lens of time-bound humans presents, the ultimate knot that you're not going to undo. I'll just put that out there. All right? So if any of you are theoretical physicists and you feel like you've got it figured out, I'll let you have your time up here. Sometime you're the trimester, but so when we say God exists out of time, what do we even really mean by that? We can say things like 1,000 years is as a day. I was reading a few years ago a book, and if you're into this sort of thing, it's a very fascinating book. God is a mathematician. And kind of indicating how, in a variety of ways, mathematics seems to sort of express there has to be enough power for mathematics to work the way it does. It's just, a numbers like pi to exist. The circumference and radius of circles. But one of the points that he makes is, infinity is another way of talking about eternity or singularities. But infinity, in fact, when we draw a little infinity symbol, often refer to, that means things are undefined. But we know a little bit about infinity. In fact, think about it. We can say that the set of whole numbers is smaller than the set of real numbers, even though they both are infinite. But that in itself is paradoxical. Hey, wait a minute. Yeah, okay, it makes sense that this is bigger than this, but how can it be bigger if they all go on forever? Well, again, that's sort of the nature of this. ambiguous. Every time you think I've got a handle on it, there's always a means of saying, well, wait a minute. You know, you're right back to the Avengers thing. Well, it doesn't work like that. Now, but it does bring up troubling questions. It brings up, you know, if God is outside of time and he knows everything in advance, how am I really choosing? And if you've got all this worked out, does it mean that I'm just like a piece of a clock? Everything was, as David said, all my days were ordained before I was born. And so then, we might not be dealing with time travel specifically, or God's timeless nature, but we come up with what I'm referring to here as easy answers to those questions. Now, we may do that for a while, we lay it down. In college, we were big into these questions, even though that was 100 years ago now for me. But I do remember it, you know, and I had some nice answers worked out in my own head, and over the last 40 years, I realized, you know, that's really not much of an answer. You know, you start thinking, well, okay. Well, for instance, we come up with things like, well, yeah, he's not choosing individuals, he's choosing believers as a whole. But, okay. But in choosing believers as a whole, well, who makes up the believers as a whole? Individuals. You really haven't gotten out of that pickle. And there are a number of ways in which people try to explain this. I remember when I was in college, a very well-respected older Bible student who had lots of good insights, he got a, so let me explain foreknowledge. You know, that's okay, this can be interesting. So it's like you having a model train, and you have track, and you see the two engines heading toward each other. Well, and you know they're going to collide, you understand this, but you're not making them collide. You know, you just know it's going to happen. You know, over the years, the more I thought about that, that doesn't explain anything. You know, really, you're going to say things like I said here, knowing isn't causing? If you know what's going to happen, in fact, I'll fall back on Avenger World here for a minute. Like in the Spider-Man, you know, the young Spider-Man says, well, you know, when you have the powers I have and you don't do something, then those bad things are happening because of you. It's not so easy to jump, to just pull causality out of such a world. Now, again, I'm not charging the God that we don't have choices. I'm just saying these present fundamental paradoxes like the deity and humanity of Christ. I think we should view it as these are things, some of which we just cannot solve. And we're going to have, in fact, is healthy, that we live with. And so we then need to ask, by living with it, how do we balance this? Because the Lord's referred to it Wednesday. The 2nd and 3rd century, what happened when certain people or groups decided we're going to resolve this whole paradox with the deity and humanity? Where did they end up?
Where they started.
Right, either where they started or in something that was way off. And I would submit to you somebody like John Calvin, who I think is a massive one. I think if you read his works, you come away thinking John Calvin is a brilliant person. But I think Calvin decided, I'm going to figure out exactly how salvation works and solve paradoxes. Well, how did he do that? Well, by so emphasizing God's sovereignty that there's really no room for these choices. But, of course, our talking Wednesday, I think by sometimes running away from that, you can get in the ditch on the other side. And so limit God's sovereignty that God becomes almost superfluous to salvation. You just, well, he's sort of there at the beginning, but it doesn't really matter that much now. Jim?
Oh, this was particularly about a Calvinistic point you made. The problem with it is not that Calvin so emphasized the sovereignty of God, it's how he defined the sovereignty of God. In a phrase, God makes every decision. That's basically the Calvinistic view toward. And so I don't really make any decisions, and then we're back to the conundrum of my free will and God's sovereignty. And
right.
we just go round and round, and basically, someone has used the phrase, basically what we ultimately have to come to is the willing suspension of disbelief. So.
Well, and I think that's right. I think, and we caution that on all these paradoxes, putting ourselves in a position where we let one set of passages completely bully and dominate another set is not what we're after. We want to balance. But like I said, we don't want to get in the other ditch either, where we so limit and we so view it as, well, it's just us now. You know, God did what Christ died on the cross, and now it's us. You know, yes, sir.
So I'm trying to grab a hold somewhere. So can we agree that foreknowledge is not equal foreordination?
Well, I don't know that I can say exactly those things because God did again, places like Psalm 139, it said, your days were ordained before you were born. Again, what I'm encouraging us is just, we've got to be careful, like on the deity and humanity of Christ. Well, if we're going to say this about his humanity, doesn't this say this about his deity? Well, no. Well, let me try to come back here and I'll let you all comment then. First, if we're balancing these two sides, one, God has plans, purposes, and choices. Second, God has the ultimate power. Again, I think that is, we should recognize, I don't think this would be controversial to us, that God has the ultimate power. And he has knowledge to make things happen, not just at a point in time, but across time. So let me ask you, if we take those two things, how does that inform or help or motivate you or me? Rather than trying to solve the paradox, let's start with that. Yes, sir.
God has chosen to limit himself in order for our free will to be truly free.
That's one way of thinking about it.
See, that's part of our conundrum. Is God a free moral agent? If so, can he limit himself? That brings up a whole other.
Okay, let me back up here, and I'm going to reemphasize this. I'm not going down the road of trying to resolve the paradox, because we're not going to fix it. Let's try to answer the question I'm putting to you. That question is, how did these things help or inform or motivate?
That's to me the practical thing. It's like if I believe that everything rides on my choice that I'm going to make moment by moment, it's a crushing weight I cannot bear, because if I don't trust that God is sovereignly working all things out ultimately according to his plan and purpose, including my choices in some sense, again, that I can't explain. And then on the other hand, if I, so as you pointed out, emphasize that, it becomes, well, I don't really have a choice, but nowhere does the Bible address me in a way that says, live as if your choice doesn't matter. My choices matter, but it's not like everything downstream from the choice that I make today determines the course of history. No, God is sovereign, and he will.
The example I was thinking was Hezekiah. King Hezekiah, you're going to die because I'm going to take my people to Babylon. But But then Hezekiah prays, so he has this choice. No, I want to live, and then he lives. Well, then he has a son. Within the span of time that he lives, he was childless before, and then that son goes on to be in the lineage of Christ. So, Christ would still have come through the line of David, just through maybe Hezekiah's brother, instead of Hezekiah and Manasseh. So when we talk about God having choices, I think that's a good example.
Yeah, let me put up the next 2 points because they relate to what Laura's talking about. God's faithfulness to plans and mankind's response to faith are central to his plan. God gives humans moral natures, choice, responsibilities, and expectations. And so again, I tried to summarize in those 4 bullets, but try to summarize there the balance we're trying to reach. And instead of saying, well, if I emphasize these bottom 2, doesn't that mean these first 2? Okay, let's not try to, let's say, all right, how does this help me? And like we did Wednesday, how does thinking about God's deity, how does that help me? How does that inform me? How does that motivate me? How does thinking about his humanity help and inform me, right? Knowing that there's some border between the deity and humanity that we cannot figure out. And I think this is the same thing. How does God's purposes, choice, and his abilities, how does that help me? And then all of these instructions that would not make much sense if we don't have some choice on our own, what does that teach me? All right. Jay, and then I'll come back.
There's a real simple statement that Paul makes in Romans 9, verse 16, that I think comes to bear on all this. He says, so then it is not him who wills, nor him who runs, but God who shows mercy. I'm not going to figure this stuff out. There's no way. It's God who shows mercy.
Yeah, and I think as we get to grace and faith, I think we'll come back to this, but I think one of the things we can see is, all right, even if we can't figure it all out, we do have a sense of, well, who is the prime?
Yes.
Who's at the root?
Yes.
And I think that we should see that God and his plans, his purposes, that is at the root.
And humans aren't going to interfere with
Right. And whatever his plans are, we're not going to alter that outcome. Yes, sir.
So it bolsters my faith to know that God, who can choose to be in time and space or not, as he sees fit, has actually put parameters around himself. From the very beginning, when he said God created heavens and the earth, he automatically started putting boundaries not only around us, but around how he was going to interact with us. And so all of the things that you have on your great slide there that we hope we'll be able to share online, you can put it there. All of those are actually choices that he has made to limit himself so that we can enjoy his mercy. His mercy is him limiting himself so that we can be in his presence, so that we can feel his mercy. I've got no problem with God deciding to limit his power so that I can deal with him. In fact, that's why I'm a Christian, right?
Yeah, I just would encourage all of us, we want to be careful in deciding, okay, I'm going to see this from God's perspective. One thing, and I think we can see this from the deity of humanity. Look, these are not paradoxes from God. He's got it figured out. And sometimes we cross that boundary. We think, well, in fact, I think skeptics, when they come to this question, see, I presented things that are too hard for God to figure out. Okay, that's not our perspective here.
Amen.
God has this figured out. And it may be exactly the way you described it. But it's very difficult for me as a time-bound, limited space type human to fully get that, because look, I don't necessarily disagree with what you said, but I can raise questions about that.
Well, because God's thoughts are always gonna be above our thoughts anyway. And that's always the caveat, right?
Right. And I think that's partly too what we want this to help and inform us and to help us, but one of our real pushes this trimester has been also this, that this border between God's choices and our choice, there's a fuzzy area. That it is difficult, if not impossible, for us to fully, as Lauren, I really like Lawrence's phrase, work out the math. You know, if you work through algebra problems where you got to get all the steps, you know, it's not just enough to have an answer and then begin. You got to work out the steps in between. It's more or less possible to work out all the steps. Right? And so learning to live with that, I say that was one of the big differences between me now and 40 years ago. I was determined, I'm going to get rid of the fuzziness. And then it began dawning on me, just like with the deity of humanity in Christ, okay, there are questions I can ask that I cannot answer. Right? That doesn't mean God isn't God. That doesn't mean he can't answer. That means I can't answer. You know, that.
Think about the fuzziness with Abraham and God over Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah, that's a little microcosm of, in fact, that in many ways relates to Wednesday's prayer providence. You see this back and forth between God and Abraham.
That's where our faith comes in. Trusting God that just maybe I can help these people see.
Yeah.
But it wasn't possible.
You need to hold on to that, Jake.
Okay.
Jim Garrett may need you. Others?
Well, God ceases to be God if we ever had the ability to figure him out. If we ever had the ability to get rid of the fuzziness, then God ceases to be God.
Yeah.
And that is why our God is awesome as he is.
That's a good point. Thank you all. Thank you for your input.